Hello, welcome back. This is Mr. Wolf. Today we'll be going over geometry benchmark number 4. I can identify and solve algebraic problems using parallel lines and transversals. So just to jog your memory real quick, remember parallel lines look something like this. Two lines running side by side like railroad tracks that will never ever cross because the distance between them always stays the same, no matter whether we're measuring here, here, or way off in the distance over here. This distance between them will still be the same. And in addition to parallel lines, we're also including a transversal, which is just a line that cuts straight across our parallel lines like so. For this benchmark, we'll be concerned about the angles that the two parallel lines make with the transversal. And once you understand the basic concepts, you'll see this benchmark is actually really simple. Here's a more descriptive visual to aid us. You'll see we've got our two parallel lines here, and this line here is called our transversal. And when we run this transversal through, well, let's just say we ran it through one line, okay, we create 4 angles. Since we have 2 lines, we have 8 angles. And keep in mind, we could add a third if we wanted, a fourth, or we could add infinite parallel lines. And all the angles that we're about to solve for would all be the same, since the lines are parallel. Okay, so what's key here is looking at angle relationships and being able to see which angles are congruent. Now let's start with angle 1 right here. I'm going to use my highlighter to mark angle 1, which is this angle here. Okay. Right, and it's easy to see that the vertical angle is congruent to angle 1, the vertical angle being the one opposite from it, and that's angle 4. Okay, so vertical angles are congruent. We know 1 and 4 are congruent. If we look at 2 and 3, we might initially think, well, maybe 2 and 3 are congruent to 1 and 4, but it's easy to see that 2 and 3 occupy a much smaller space. So while 2 and 3 are congruent to each other, they are not congruent to 1 and 4. Let's head down here to our other line, and we see what angle corresponds with angle 1 down here. Is it 5, 6, 7, 8? One of these angles occupies the same space as angle 1, and that's why we call it a corresponding angle. That angle is, of course, angle 5. So we'll mark that angle like so. And we know that the vertical angle to 5 is 8, and so that angle has to be congruent. We know the corresponding angle to angle 3 is angle 7 down here. So let's go ahead and mark that as so. There we go. And 6 is the congruent angle there. So if you just pause for a moment and look what we've got, you can see that 1, 4, 5, and 8 are all congruent. And it's easy to see that because they're all obtuse angles. They're bigger than 90. And 2, 3, 6, and 7 are all congruent. Those are all acute angles. Okay? So we've already established which angles are congruent. What if we were to mix a green and a pink? So let's say that we want to talk about angles 1 and 2 that are right next to each other. Well, we see that when we connect those, it forms this straight line right here. And we know that straight lines are always 180 degrees. So we don't know what 1 and 2 are, but we do know that they add up to 180 degrees. This would also be true for 2 and 4, 4 and 3, and 3 and 1. And if you come down here and do the same thing, you've got 7 and 8, you've got 5 and 7, 6 and 5, and 8 and 6. They all add up to 180. And you'll remember that angles that add up to 180 are called supplementary. That's right. Please don't forget that term. So far we've looked at which angles are congruent and which angles are supplementary, and we can also make some other assumptions, but let's move forward here so we can name our angles properly. Anything between our parallel lines we're going to refer to as interior, and anything outside the parallel lines we'll call exterior. Remember, interior means inside, exterior means outside, so if you can just remember inside or outside the parallel lines, you'll know which are which. Okay, and we know that there are certain relationships, and we've already established a couple of them. Corresponding angles lie on the same side of the transversal. So we're talking about angles like 1 and 5 are corresponding, 3 and 7 are, so forth. Okay. If we're talking about alternate interior angles, we're talking about angles inside, which will be in this brownish orange zone. And if we say alternate, that means we're talking about angles that are on alternate sides of the transversal. So we could be talking about 5 and 4, or we could be talking about 6 and 3. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing. It's kind of distracting. Let's jump back here again. 3 and 6 are alternate interior angles, and what do we know about 3 and 6? Yes, they are congruent. 5 and 4 are alternate interior angles. What do we know about them? They are congruent. Okay, we've got alternate interior, we've got alternate exterior. Alternate exteriors would be like 8 and 1. What's the relationship between 8 and 1? They're congruent. 7 and 2, they're congruent. I sound like a broken record here. And the last is same side interior angles, or we often say consecutive interior angles. So that means that they are in a row. So 3 and 5 would be consecutive interior angles, and 4 and 6 would be consecutive interior angles. Let's flash back to our drawing here. 3 and 5, well, we know they aren't equal, so they have to be supplementary. 4 and 6, same side, supplementary. So an easy way that I remember this, if I see alternate, I think congruent. If I see same side or consecutive, then I think supplementary. Okay, a little brush up on our properties. The transitive property I always call the middleman property, and that says if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So what we did was we removed the middleman B and set A equal to C. Okay, this is like if I say that John is the same height as Mario, and Mario is the same height as Will. Well, now we can say that John is the same height as Will. It's the transitive property. Okay, and this comes into play when we're looking at, well, if we know angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent, and we know that angle 3 and 8 are corresponding, so they're congruent, well, then we know that angle 1 and angle 8 are also congruent. Why? For the transitive property. Okay? And of course, the converse is true as well. So if I tell you that angle 13 is congruent to angle 9, that should tell you that, well, then these two lines have to be parallel. Okay? So the original statement says if two lines are parallel, then corresponding angles are congruent. The converse would just be the opposite. If these two angles are congruent, then we know the lines are parallel. And that applies for all of our relationship pairs, be it corresponding, alternate interior, alternate exterior, consecutive interior, exterior. Okay? Let's look at 3 practice problems and then we'll wrap up here. Okay, so we've got our 2 parallel lines right here and here. I know they're parallel because they even marked them for me right there. And then this would make our transversal here. Okay, so the first thing I notice is that this expression has y, this expression has x. And we all know that it's tough to mix x's and y's, just like it is to mix apples and oranges. So let's find something that's more convenient. Right now, the first thing I notice is these angles are right next to each other. Flashback, what do we know about angles right next to each other? They are supplementary. So I don't know what y is, but I do know that if we combine this angle, combine of course means plus, with its adjacent angle, we know that they're going to equal 180. Okay? We can combine these two because they're like terms. 68 minus 16 would be, well, let's see, minus 10 would be 58. And minus 6 would be 52. All right. Let's subtract 52 from each side. And when we do 180 minus 1, or excuse me, minus 52, I end up with 128. There we go. And last step, of course, divide by 4, divide by 4, and I get y equals, and I believe that's going to be 37. Does that sound right? 27? That's probably more accurate. Let me grab my calculator here. 128 divided by 4 is 32. I'm way off on each. Please forgive me. Okay, so now we know y equals 32. I can plug that in and figure out what this angle is. And the next question would be, how do we get x? Well, we get x because we know the relationship between this exterior angle and this alternate exterior angle. Alternate, remember when we hear alternate, we think congruent. So I know that these two angles have to be congruent. I'm going to plug in my 32 here. 4 times 32 equals 128. Subtract 16, and we get 112 for this angle measure here, which means that this angle down here has to equal 112 as well. And then we would add our 24, so we get 2x equals 136. So x has to equal 72. Now we've solved for y and for x, and it really wasn't even that hard. Let's look at another one here. Again, I see y and x here. I know these two angles that are adjacent and form this straight line are going to equal 180. However, I don't like mixing y's and x's. It's tough to solve for one variable when you have two. So let's use this 36 over here. We know that this angle and this angle are alternate exterior angles. So we know that 136 has to equal 3y plus 31. So we just go through and solve. Once I know what y is, I plug in. Once I know what this whole angle is, I set that and this equal to 180. By now you should start noticing that everything seems to either be congruent or equal to 180. If you can understand that the concept really boils down to just that, this is a really easy benchmark. Here's one more problem. You can pause and solve that if you want. Let's summarize here and wrap this up. First off, I didn't mention at the beginning of the video, but you have to have taken notes over this. So if you weren't taking notes, you need to go back, skim the video again, and take a page of the notes. Okay? When we write, we remember. So we already know what parallel lines are. Two lines that continue on forever and never cross. So sad. Transversal, that's simply a line that cuts through parallel lines. We know congruent means the same thing as equals. It's just we use congruent with shapes. We know supplementary means that it adds up to 180. Okay? And these last are all of our different angle pairs. We know corresponding angles are congruent. Anything with alternate always seems to be congruent, and anything with consecutive always seems to be supplementary. So really, that's all we have to remember. Okay? As always, be sure you have notes. Text me if you have questions. Come see me for morning or afternoon tutoring. I'm always here to help. Signing out, Mr. Wolf.